Welcome to Brain in the Vat. We are delighted to have JP Smit join us on the show. JP is a South African, but he studied at Cambridge, where my cousin Andrew Cooper studied, and he studied under one of our favorite guests, Simon Blackburn. We're going to be talking about institutions and money. JP, would you like to start with a thought experiment?
So imagine you have a prison economy where the prisoners have taken to using cigarettes as currency, as often has historically happened. And imagine you have a guard, and the guard hates the one prisoner, and the guard takes the one prisoner's cigarettes and just sort of tears them up in front of him and flushes them down a toilet in order to let this prisoner lose money. Now, let's say these prisoners, and this is where it really does turn into a thought experiment, they have prodigious memories and they are completely honest. And they say, hang on. We're not on board with what this guard did. What we're going to do is you lost 3 cigarettes. We'll still count them. It's fine. You have 3 cigarettes. Whenever you want to give someone else pay for something, we just remember you transferred 1 to that person. You have 1 less. They have 1 more. And we'll just keep a record because we have prodigious memories and we're perfectly honest of who has these, so to speak, virtual cigarettes. Now, it seems there's nothing incoherent about this. Things can go this way. And more importantly, it seems then the prisoner has lost cigarettes, but the prisoner has lost no money. And so the thought experiment would be, well, how can this be the case? And ultimately, I'm going to use that sort of case to claim that money is not a physical object. It has never been a physical object, even where people use gold or silver or shells or whatever as money. None of that's ever been money. What we should recognize money is, in fact, something abstract.
Okay, it's a nice case. So I want to give one possible explanation for what's happening when the cigarettes are thrown away but no money is lost. And this explanation would be given by Searle, who I understand you're not a fan of his work in the sense that you object to his work, although philosophers are fans of other philosophers when they object to them. So here's Searle's explanation. So Searle says that something counts as money in a certain case if we collectively believe that it counts as money. Then it becomes money. So in the original case, you've got the cigarettes. The prisoners collectively believe that they count as money, and so they are money. And then once that collective agreement changes, which is what happens when the guards say, we have prodigious memories, we're going to throw away your cigarettes and now instead count virtual cigarettes. Now there's no longer the collective belief that cigarettes count as money, and that's replaced with a different collective belief, which is that these virtual points in the guards' minds, and maybe through their utterances or through their scribblings, those count as money. And so the collective beliefs have changed, which is why in the one case you've got money before the throwing away of the cigarettes, and after the throwing away of the cigarettes, you no longer have money. In the instance of the cigarettes, instead, the money lies in the guard's thoughts about those cigarettes.
Okay, so a little bit of background to that. So as you say, it is typically the philosophers you like that you spend a lot of time on thinking about and reading and so on that you end up also attacking. I do that maybe to a slightly pathological degree. Most of the work I do is philosophy of language. The people I most read were Kripke and Russell, and I ended up publishing papers claiming they are fundamentally wrong in their fundamental claims about the theory of reference for names. And it's similar with Searle. So we, and by we I mean me and my co-authors, this is me and Philip Beekens, philosophy professor in Belgium in Leuven, and Stan du Plessis, an economist there at Stellenbosch, we sort of have the anti-Searlean view. So the Searlean view, as you say, is ultimately the view that, well, what makes something an institutional object like money or a border or a country or a driver's license? Well, he says that it's the object of some sort of collective recognition that we can put in the form X counts as Y in C, where X is the thing, counts as Y is the institutional characterization of the thing, and C is just the context, right? So you'd say, for instance, this dollar bill, this physical object, counts as money in the United States of America. This river counts as a border, between South Africa and Zimbabwe, and so on and so forth. So as you say. Now, we are the sort of anti-Searlean group. We originally started writing, I think it was about 2011, proposing a different view, a view where ultimately we say that stuff, as Wittgenstein would say, is a wheel that turns nothing else in the mechanism. You don't need it to explain anything. You don't need to characterize anything. And ultimately, it doesn't capture the essence of an institutional object. We give a sort of game theoretical account. Subsequently, also, we have sort of brothers in arms on this, Francesco Guala and Frank Hendricks. They are philosophers in Milan and in Netherlands. And they also give a game theoretical account of institutional objects. So that sort of situates us on the conceptual universe in this case. Oddly, though, on this topic, I'm going to slightly defend Searle in one sense. So I don't think that's what makes it money, is that it's the object of the sort of collective acceptance, but that's by the by. Searle originally gave his theory, and then Barry Smith objected that, well, occasionally you have a problem. There's no thing, right? And his example, he says, well, with borders, there's typically, there's a river or there's a mountain, or, you can put up a fence. And, you can even allow abstraction. You can say there's a line of extensionless points, still explicitly allows abstraction. But in the case of money, what counts? Because as he points out, most modern economies, there's very, very little of the actual money that is in circulation that is printed. The banks only you only need to print as much as you need. Typically, I think it's something like 3% or less than 3% of the money in the world exists in the form of, physical notes and coins. The rest of it's just sort of records on a server, right? And then Searle said, well, that's no problem at all. We have notes and coins, and then we have these records on a server. These records on a server count as money. Okay. But then Barry Smith came back and said, no, but that doesn't work because these records on a server are records. They're records of something. If we destroy the one record, well, that's fine. We hopefully have a backup, something like that. They act as records in that sense. The question remains, what are they a record of? And so that, in the sort of dialectic of the debate, gave the money problem a great importance, because suddenly you have what's called the problem of freestanding Y terms. You have these institutional characterizations that don't latch onto anything, whether abstract or concrete. And Searle, in response, changed his theory ultimately, and quite a while later. He said X counts as Y and C as a good characterization, but ultimately there's a better characterization that just defines it in terms of deontic status. Now, the eventual formulation is much uglier, right? And to be honest, I can't even remember it now. I don't like the eventual formulation. There's a lot to be said for elegance. So in this specific paper that we wrote, what is called Cigarettes, Bitcoins, and Dollars, we actually try and claim, no, there is this thing, money, but it's abstract. Just like in Searle's example of the border being a line of extensionless points. In this case, there's the thing, just it's abstract, but, that's not the same as there being nothing. So in this paper, actually, we put forward a view, one half of which depends on our theory of institutions, the game theoretical view, the other half which just does not. We say there is this thing, that is money. If I can explain the theory a little bit there, the best way to explain is by analogy. So take chess. We can play chess on a board, right? That's one thing we can do. We move the pieces around. And of course, we also have chess notation. Chess notation, that's the sort of thing that's published in the newspapers with, famous chess games and so on. And we normally say chess notation is just a record of what's happening on a board, which it is. With me? Of course, we can remove the board. You get things like blind chess. You don't need the board. What you can do in theory is also people just shout out the notation. Now, in that case, people still have the notion, at least, of a board, but you could also go as far as say, well, let's take chess notation, treat it as uninterpreted formal symbols, but they do create something called a game tree, with certain states being where you want to get to, certain states being not allowed, so on and so forth. Certain state counts as checkmate. You don't, in theory, even need a conception of a board to conceive of chess in this way, so that for every set of symbols, there's a possible set of symbols you can shout out, and eventually you get to something not allowed, or you eventually get to a win position or a lose position or something like that. We can imagine, in fact, some software, you do get implementations of chess on computers that work that way. Typically they don't, but you do get some that do. Now, here's another more elegant way of viewing the situation. Since what is in common between chess notation and the board is that they map onto this game tree, we can say, well, the chess notation is one way of keeping track, just writing down the state of our game, where we are on this game tree, which is, the step of sequential moves. And we can also treat the board as just a record of where we are on this game tree. But what makes chess chess, what would make the game played using chess notational chess and the game using the board chess is the fact that it maps onto this game tree. So both are records. We can interpret the chess notation not as a record of what's happening on the board, but a record of a recording of an abstract fact, namely sort of the position on a game tree. And now we can treat money the same way. We can say these records on a server are just records of some abstract fact. And in fact, when we exchange notes and coins, what we're doing is the same thing. It's like playing chess on a board. We are actually just changing positions relative to some abstract fact and keeping record of that. So we say notes and coins relate to each other. Both are records. It's not that, like Searle says, the record on a server or counting entries are records and the physical coins are the real thing. No, we say both are records. They've always been records. So that's sort of the one part of the theory. Then there comes the question now, but exactly then, what is it a record of? If we think of the analogy to chess, that becomes the question, so how do we specify this abstract object? And we say, well, here's a nice way to put it, right? Why does $1 plus $1 equal $2? Well, in our case, 1 rand plus 1 rand equal 2 rands. In the case of normal things, it's easy. We say, well, if you have 1 apple and another apple, that equals 2 apples. Why? Because there's this thing, an apple, and we have 2 of it. Everybody with me? Okay. That doesn't work for dollars, obviously. If you have $1 plus $2, it does equal $2, but there's no thing, namely the dollar, and you now have 2 of it. Like I said, this it's not a matter of, there being enough dollar bills and you happen to own, each individual dollar bill. Rather, it's just the case that, we allow this sort of addition and subtraction. 1 plus 1 equals 2, but not because there's this underlying thing. And the answer we say ultimately is dollars aren't units, just like rands aren't units. So it's not the same case as say there's 1 plus 1 meter equals 2 meters because, there's this thing, the meter, we've measured it and you have 2 of it. Rather, it just is the case that we have this number assignment. We assign numbers to people. So I can say there's 1 for Jason, there's 2 for me, there's a half for Mark, and we have these numbers. We have under no obligation whatsoever to even call them anything. But when we call them something, that's when we say we have 2 rands, we just say, well, you have the number 2 assigned to you in the rand system. So dollars ranson is the name of an assignment system. It's not the name of a measure or an underlying thing. You like thought experiments? We show up on an island. We want a monetary system. We can agree amongst ourselves, or I don't know, someone with a stick can convince us you better do this or I'll hit you or whatever. But somehow the incentives are created such that it comes about. And this person says, okay, you have 1, you have 3, I have 5. And this allows us to trade among ourselves. And this person then makes a critical commitment to recognize the system and to not just, hyperinflate their own amount. Well, we can then say, I trade with you. I had 2. Now I have 1 because I've given you 1. You had 1. Now you have 2. And we can keep going. There's no huge objection there. We never even have to say, well, it's 1 rand or $1 or £1 or whatever we wish. What you ultimately have is numbers that are assigned to people. These numbers only really matter in as much as they're ratios of a whole. That's why we say they're what's called relative ratio scale numbers. The only thing that really matters is your percentage of the whole. That's why you can redenominate. You can add a 0 to each account. It doesn't matter, right? They only count as a ratio to the whole. And we say ultimately the way we express it, since you can talk about being assigned a number or a position on the number line in a sort of slightly metaphorical way, we say when we trade rands, we are changing positions on the relative ratio scale created by the rand assignment system. And yes, that's our theory. And this would be the case forever. This is the case for the prisoners in the prison. Well, they're assigned numbers from the physical fact of the number of cigarettes they own. But the important thing is not the cigarettes. The fact is that they come in, different amounts. So the one is assigned 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And that's, their role is record keeping and evidence that you've been assigned that number. And that's why if you get rid of the cigarettes and you replace the evidence with, well, we're just perfectly honest, we have prodigious memories, absolutely nothing changes. So that essentially is our argument for any, and that's always been the case. Even though people don't think about it this way today, they've never really thought about it this way. The ultimate thing that what makes money work, we say money is software, it's not hardware. There's some protocol that is being implemented. What ultimately happens is there's a way of assigning numbers to people. Then there's some incentive to use this as a medium of exchange. The incentivization can come around in a lot of different ways, but there is a thing. There's this abstract, there's this number assigned to you. Alternatively phrased, you're assigned a position on a relative ratio scale. And so we actually don't think Searle need to have changed his theory for that. He can say, well, X counts as Y and C. The X in this case just is your position on this relative ratio scale. So in that sense, half of our paper actually, well, wasn't intended as a defense of Searle, but, it's consistent with Searle. Then the other half of the paper, we, of course, give an analysis that's more congenial to our view. So that's a long answer, but that's the essence of our view. We say the things we normally call money are records. They've always been money. They've always been records. And this is what they are records of.
So there's a wonderful film called Goodbye Lenin, and it's set in East Germany at a time when the Soviet Union falls. The lead character's mother falls into like a deep sickness, and the son is told by all of the doctors, look, you need to try and keep everything the same for her. If she encounters any dramatic change, it could kill her. So he has to keep finding these old East German pickles and provide them to her. And at some point she says to him, I've been worried about you and about your well-being, and so I've been saving. And so if you go and crack open some of our walls, you'll see that I've been storing notes. And so he grabs the notes out of the walls, but it's too late. These Deutschmarks have been demonetized. And so there's a beautiful scene where he's sitting on top of his apartment building, throwing the notes as they flutter in the wind, and you can see the statue of Lenin being casted away. And so if I think about demonetization, this idea that something which was once valuable, which everybody recognized as money, which the state told people was money, now no longer has the status of money. It just becomes a piece of paper or an interesting historical object. How do you make sense of that? What's doing the work that's changing how we view the object?
On the Searlean view, that's easy enough, right? He's got this thing, you've got the physical object, which you still have in your case, and then counts as money in this case, East Germany, and there it just no longer counts as money, right? On our view, similar sort of story. I mean, to make a very long story short, we're going to say, so yes, you still have the physical object, and it still will often have financial value. I mean, Roman coins are collector's items. Deutschmarks, I assume, might very well be as well, but it no longer counts as a medium of exchange. And so in this case, that's easy enough. We say you're incentivized to acquire it as a medium of exchange, and then we have a cashing out of the notion of medium of exchange, because ultimately we say we have to reduce institutional terminology to non-institutional terminology, and we have a cashing out of the notion of exchange, and also we cash out the notion of a medium, because to most ears, for some people hear it as an intermediary, that's fine. Other people seem to hear it as a medium, a little bit of metaphor of like, value passes through this medium, a little bit like, say, sound would propagate through air. And so we give a cashing out of this notion of a medium, and we give a cashing out of this notion of an exchange. It's quite ugly, although I think it's correct. We don't need to get into it. But so that part, I think, will be easy enough. We say, historically, economists have three defining features of money: unit of account, store of value, medium of exchange. We say, no, the medium of exchange one is the definitive one. The others two are important, but they're not conceptually required. They are the unit of account one is the likely causal consequence of adopting it as a medium of exchange, but it's not necessary. And then the store of value one, the notion of store of value is dubious to start with. And I mean, most fiat money by design is made to be a bad store of value. It's allowed to inflate, right? But we say the medium exchange property is the relevant one. And then, we give a sort of cashing out of it. The interesting part of the cashing out is with the notion of medium of exchange. It's non-trivial. It basically boils down to you acquire something in order to use it to acquire things subsequently. But of course, there are a lot of things that are like that, right? That's all investment, that's all stocks, that's all properties. If you're on a greengrocer, that's all the produce you buy. And so we say the key feature is that you acquire it in order to realize the reduction of transaction costs that accrue in virtue of all people acquiring it for that reason. So that medium of exchange we treat as essential, and the key defining feature is this reduction of transaction costs that you get in virtue of money. And that's not true of, just when you invest in gold or equities, or you're a greengrocer buying produce or whatever.
So the problem I have with this account is something that you said at the end, which is people have never really thought about money this way, and they don't think about money this way, but this is what money is. And I think there's certain types of objects in the world that we can talk about in this way. So we can talk about free will, for example, in this way. It's not an object, but it's certain phenomena. Another thing might be certain scientific objects or objects that scientists discover or examine. So we might say that quarks have been misconceived up to a certain point, but then conceived correctly later. Maybe we understand the mechanics of electricity. I'm not sure if electricity is mechanical. I'm not a scientist. I'm assuming it's not, but maybe we understand the inner workings of electricity in a way over time that improves. And so we discover its very essence. But social phenomena are not like that. So social phenomena, you can't give, on my view, a theory of social phenomena that is so complicated and unlike our everyday understanding of them. Why? Because without us participating in those objects, they wouldn't exist. Whereas in the other cases I gave, so for example, electricity would exist or not exist regardless of whether there were any minds in the world. So if there was an apocalypse today, if all human beings were removed from the world today, there would still be power stations running for quite some time. There would still be electricity in the lines. So let's just say in one instant, all human beings were removed from the earth. You've still got power running to my PC that I'm talking to you through at the moment. So it doesn't require humans understanding, interaction, belief in it in order for it to be there. But what you're saying is that there's a social phenomenon. There's money. And money has this incredibly complex theory about how it functions. That can't be the case, especially if, as you've said, we don't generally think of money in this way. That can't be the case. It can't be the case that we discover the essence of money that is so complicated that none of us would think about it that way. And that's what it really is. Why? Because we all use it all the time. And without us, it wouldn't be there. If all humans cease to exist right now, so would money. But it wouldn't be the case for electricity. That's why you can discover the essence of electricity and give a very complicated theory about it in which that none of us would think about when we're using electricity. But you can't do that for money. So I think that your theory fails a necessary condition for theories about social phenomena to be good theories. But Searle's theory doesn't make that failure. The idea that X counts in Y and C is, as you said, it's very parsimonious. It's very simple and it's elegant. I don't think it's right either. Just like you've said, you don't think it's right in certain ways, although in this way, it might characterize money fairly well. But the point is, it doesn't fail on that necessary condition for a good social theory. It's not complicated. It's something that anyone who understands money and uses it would say, oh, yeah, that makes sense. That's what we're doing when we talk about money. But when we listen to your theory, we think, oh my goodness, this is very complicated. This is not how we think about money. Then it can't be the right theory.
So that's an objection we got, in fact, in the Bitcoin paper from one of the referees. And we wrote a response that I think quite compelling on this specific topic. It's an interesting problem. There was actually a paper by someone else a couple of years ago. I love the title. It's called The Outer Limits of Obliviousness. Like exactly how oblivious can you be before, your account turns incoherent? And on our account, you can be reasonably oblivious, admittedly, right? I think ultimately that objection fails for the following reason. We're giving the kind of explanation that you give in game theory, right? Think of the convention of driving on the left-hand side of the road in South Africa. Now, a game theorist would quite correctly say, what explains this? Well, it's a coordination game. And coordination games are such that almost inevitably what happens is either by precedent or by sort of a psychological habit, there's a focal point. And once you have maybe a little bit of initial chaos, it settles down. And then it tends to be reasonably stable because you tend to strike something like a Nash equilibrium where there's no incentive in favor of a unilateral defection. Now, almost no one who drives on the road has any conception of coordination games and focal points in Nash equilibria and unilateral defection, right? So we take our account to be the same kind of account. What does the power in some sense is the game theory. I mean, you can think of game theory as sort of I always like the description, it's the mathematics of sociology, right? There are these factors that pertain to interpersonal interaction that is not completely, but to a large extent, independent of individual belief, attitude, and so on. And it just kind of happens in the sense, at least, that once you hit that point, it tends to remain stable. Now, that was the driving case. I mean, think the cigarettes in a prison case, right? It's completely coherent. Even I don't have to say the prisoners have any complex theory about the ultimate nature of money. They just need to get angry and say something like, no, you still have 3. We will just sort of remember. They can do that, right? They don't need any complicated theory or deep insight into what the game theorists would say is ultimately happening in order to make that work. What the game theorists would say is as long as they have any sort of attitude that prompts this behavior, it's fine. Probably the answer is going to turn into something like there's no specific attitude required. There's just an attitude required that results in the following behavior. And so I don't know if I would apply this to all institutional phenomena. My work is sort of, we're the people who try and replace Searle. So we're doing institutional ontology, which is sort of a subset of social ontology. Social ontology general, there I think I'd be more inclined to that sort of belief, like Searle's example of, say, a cocktail party or something. Maybe there we need to have some or other conception. Maybe, I'm not saying I commit to that. But for the institutional stuff, I don't think we need it. In fact, we often do this in our papers. Someone says there's some attitude or belief or something required. Like Searle always says you need collective intentionality. Now, we're not against collective intentionality. We don't know if it exists or not. We're completely agnostic on the matter. Don't hate it, don't love it. But we just show that you can stipulate there's a group of beings who simply cannot have collective intentionality in the sense Searle means. And you can still make them have meetings, you can make them have borders, countries, money, all this sort of stuff. It's just not essential and it's not conceptually required, even though if there is such a thing, it can play a useful role in bringing it about. So I think the best way to think about it in some sense is a little bit like, think of software that can be implemented in various ways, right? Game theory sort of brought, explanations, and then sort of the money protocol. You only need enough to make it work. The people in question can be oblivious, they can be deceived, they have false beliefs, but in some or other sense, they get into an interaction that satisfies the requirements for it to count as, say, in this case, a coordination game, and that's good enough. So I would actually think you can have a fair amount of obliviousness before it would turn into a problem. I mean, take the case of a border, right? On our account, a border is just a line dividing, say, 2 territories that by human action or belief, you're incentivized not to cross. And of course, the incentive can be, someone with a gun saying, if you cross this, I shoot you. Or it can be if people say, well, we agree that it's only fair that I don't step into your part, you step into my part. And this would also cover, 2 little kids on the backseat of a car shoving each other in the ribs, don't go into my side, and the other one, don't go into my side. We're happy to say that some sort of border has been created in the back of that car, or at least there's only a difference of degree between that and a national border, or for that matter, a provincial border, and so on. And we're not describing anything particularly sophisticated to the people involved, except a sense of mine.
Maybe there's an objection to your driving case. So you talk about how, if you think about why in society people drive on one side of the road rather than another. So in South Africa, we drive on the left side of the road. In the US, people drive on the right-hand side of the road. Why is that the case? Well, you say it's a coordination problem. And to fully understand it, you'd need to understand game theory and Nash equilibriums. And so that's supposed to be an example of a complex underpinning of a social phenomenon that we don't understand. And so just like in the case of money, we don't need to fully understand what's going on underneath in order to say that's what the essence of it is. But I think you might be confusing an essence with its causal explanation. So It is true that the causal story of how South Africans landed up driving on the left-hand side of the road involved a coordination problem. That is true. And it's true that that coordination problem is governed by certain game theoretical problems and solutions and Nash equilibriums, and let's just accept all of that. But that's not what the phenomenon of driving on the left-hand side of the road as a norm is. In other words, that's the causal explanation for what's going on, but it's not its essence. If I were to ask you, why do people drive on the left-hand side of the road, I could be asking, what is the series of events that happened such that we now have this phenomenon? And I think you've answered that question. But the second question I could be asking is, what is happening on a daily basis when people drive on the left-hand side of the road? And that answer is not, there's a game theoretical account of what's going on, and there's a Nash equilibrium that's been reached or not reached, and people drive on the left-hand side of the road. I think what's happening there is there's collective agreement that we will drive on the left-hand side of the road, full stop. So in other words, there's a distinction between the causal theory that leads, the causal explanation that leads to a social phenomenon, and what that social phenomenon is in itself. And I don't think you've given an account of what it is. I think you've given an account of the steps involved to generate it, the causal steps that preceded it. And so I don't think that you're answering the same question that Searle's answering. He's answering the question, what is the essence of the thing? And you're answering the question, how did we get there?
So if it really is the case that currently in South Africa, people drive on the left or right-hand side of the road because of a collective agreement, then this would be the most incredible social fact in the history of all of South Africa, that there's this collective agreement that we stick to such an incredible degree, right? I don't think there's a country in the world that would stick to what we ordinarily think of as a collective agreement to the degree that we stick to driving on the left-hand side of the road. So I think it being a coordination game, sustains it at present. There's a reason why you don't. Well, I mean, we do what we do because of just imitation and habit, right? It's not like we're thinking about it or, we're sort of contemplating. But what keeps that habit in place is there's no unilateral incentive to defect. If I drive on the right, someone crashes into me and I die, right? So I think that fact sustains it. So game theory very much explains why it's sustained, not only how it came about and then it turned into an agreement. I would be deeply, deeply skeptical that it's sustained by being an agreement. In fact, I don't even think it's necessarily an agreement. I would just say we know this is a good idea, so to speak, right? We know that if you drive on the right, you die. Well, most of the time. The bigger point, though, we think it's the other way around. We think Searle ultimately mistakes one way institutional facts can come about by collective agreement. And it all looks very sort of proper and, we collectively hold the following, blah, blah, blah. And that's one way you can create a border or a country or a president or money or whatever. And then we think he mistakes that for the essence of the thing. Now, that sort of collective agreement is one way things can come about. And like I said, the nature of the incentives we think are obviously incredibly important for sociology and whatever, but they don't affect what the thing is. We say that the collective agreement is just one way of making the correct incentives come about. I mean, like our example where we agree there's a border, the other example we use in our paper, someone says cross this line or get shot, or the person on the island who says we should use this money, the other options, the person on the island, has a gun and they say this is money. Ultimately, where we think we characterizing the object is, think about it this way, even on the Searlean view. Now, you can make Searle's view compatible with all of this, right? But on the Searlean view, if we agree this is a president, a border, a country, whatever, he has to explain why it is stable. And the explanation, he might not like the terminology, but it's going to boil down to, incentives. So moral belief, abilities, power, money, all that sort of stuff. So you'd have to give that explanation anyway. But if that explanation is on the table, then what is this collective belief thing doing? because some things come about by us collectively agreeing, but many things don't. Now, in that case, Searle says, well, then people, they never actually said something or agreed to something, but what there is acceptance of a virtual declaration. Now, this virtual declaration strikes as a sort of epicycle that doesn't explain much of anything. So the argument form we use in our papers is we say if we define institutional objects as we do, there's an object that you've been incentivized by human action or belief to treat in a certain way. If that works, what is the Searlean stuff doing there? Like, except for one possible route for the way it's been created, right? We don't think it's a terribly misleading thing. The analogy we use in our paper is we say, well, people say the sun rises and sets. That's not literally true, but it's not the end of the world. It's fine. We know what we mean when we say that. And in a sense, it's true. It's money when we say it's money. But occasionally we want to look under the hood and see what actually happens. And we want to make very sure we don't as Searle. So in some sense, there's a irreducible layer of social facts. So we think we prefer our account on sort of Occam's razor, right? We just don't see, except for one part of the causal explanation, what the Searlean declaration story is doing there. On that topic, so also implicit in this is a certain view of declaratives. And I've written a couple of papers about it. The third one I'm actually currently busy with. So I also think there's some important stuff there. But like I said, I'm a philosopher of language most of the time. But it'll take us a bit into the weeds to get into that now. So the short response, I think, is the other way around. And I think my way of looking at it does not complicate ontology. The problem with the Searlean account is you get this irreducible layer of social facts. He says not social objects, social facts. And we just don't see any reason to introduce that into our ontology. We also think it leads to bad habits of mind, the kind you get from sort of reification, that sort of problem.
So Jason mentioned something earlier, which is that if you took away human beings, you wouldn't interfere with a bunch of natural phenomena. They would still continue to exist, but the social phenomena might disappear. So do you think, one, that if every human being died, that money would die with them, as would government institutions and those sorts of things? And then the second question I have is, if we think about incentives, so if you've got a border between two states and there's an incentive to maintain that border, what happens if the incentives change? Does it affect the border? So if there's no longer a consequence for treating the border, in one way or another, what happens to the social object that was created?
So on the first thing, obviously, I would agree with Jason. If all people die, then money dies with it, right? There have been some weird cases in experimental sort of stuff where they got some animals to treat things as money, but let's assume that's off the table. So yes, of course, we would say because our account's a matter of the relevant incentives, and so without humans, there won't be these desires and beliefs, and so there won't be the incentives. So, of course, without people, there's no money, right? Because the incentives no longer obtain. The same sort of issue with the border, of course, here you have to be a little bit careful, right? There's also a case Searle writes about, there's a case we write about. So what can happen is the border, say, gets originally constructed in terms of an agreement, or, it's the incentives are created by violence, and then it switches over time. Let's say later, either the people come to accept, no, this is actually a good idea. It's now maintained by, moral belief. Alternatively, it's not as moral belief and it's now switched over to, it's now just a matter of, violent enforcement. So that doesn't affect whether the border exists or not, even though the nature of the incentives has changed. If there's no incentive whatsoever, then we would say the border goes. But don't mistake that for the case where, there's no enforcement, but we still, believe that we should at least treat these two areas differently. So we think that, this is something we should respect. We should not cross unless invited, something like that. We often got accused in our work, and this is kind of, I think, mostly not on us, this is on the economists, for being very, very cynical. In fact, once we got accused of saying, but you're really saying institutions don't exist, and if this is true, it'll lead to anarchy and social destruction. Obviously, we're not saying that at all. We're just trying to sort of pull away one layer of mystification, so to speak. We fully recognize moral incentives. Nothing intrinsic in our theory depends on the nature of incentives. Even if people were fully cynical or fully moral, wouldn't differ one bit. As a matter of practice, as we show in our papers, we do think a lot of the incentives that obtain in the real world is because people think something is the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do and so on, just like other incentives, involve guns or money or so on and so forth. So we're not cynics. I've had to explain this in every single paper. Now, it's the fault of the economists because when they talk about utilities, in theory, they're happy to accept there's, utility functions partially determined by moral belief. In practice, the way they talk about it, they almost always go for the most selfish sort of desire. So it's kind of, their fault. But there's nothing intrinsic to the theory that rules out moral or non-moral motivation. So your border, what did you mean? You mean the case where we don't physically enforce it? Or you mean the case where really now there's no one cares? It makes no difference to anything. Then, of course, the border withers away, as many have done historically. And remember, we also talk about borders now as don't cross, but when we say differently incentivized, we take provincial borders, right? No one's incentivized not to cross them. Rather, it's just a matter of who's incentivized to make sure the road looks nice, that sort of thing. So it's not only a matter of not crossing, it's can be a vast array of other incentives that split sort of areas.
I think you should embrace the cynic label, because that's my express label. So I'm cynical about the existence of institutions, but I still don't think it's a fair objection that if institutions didn't exist, we'd have anarchy. Why? Because people believe they exist, and so people act as if they do, and so there isn't anarchy for that reason. But I want to push Mark's case a bit further of the border that's not really enforced. But give a different kind of case, because a border, I can understand that the border withers away when it's not enforced. There are lots of other social institutions, laws, organizations. I understand you're not covering organizations specifically here, but I think the objection applies sort of across all of these phenomena, where you have the law or the institution or the organization that's become inactive or dormant over time. So the example would be a company that's created, and over time, all of its members leave, and there's no one in the company anymore, but the company still is legally recognized. And should we go digging in the records, we'd find the company, and the company could be reestablished. Members could join it again, and it could do stuff. It seems like when the company is dormant, there's no incentives associated with it, but it still exists. And on your account, you can't explain that. Another example would be a law. So there's lots of laws that were generated decades or a century ago, which are just never enforced. So there's some in certain states in the US. I'm not sure whether they've all been repealed, but over time they were gradually repealed. I think some still exist in certain states. Certain rules about sexual conduct. So you can't have sex in a dress in certain states, and you can't commit sodomy in other states. But those laws are not enforced. I'm not sure if they've all been repealed, but the point is, for a very long time, those laws existed and were never enforced, and everyone just sort of forgot about them until some legislative body at some point decided to just vote them out. They were lame duck laws. It's a lame duck corporation. It's inactive. It has no incentives associated with it either way, but it still exists. It still exists. And on your account, we can't explain why, because there's no incentives associated with it.
I think there's a very important sense in which, take the law case, right? The old laws governing, sexual conduct, that the only reason they're still on the books is because no one challenges them, and the law has a sensible principle: don't strike down a law that's not challenged, right? I think there's a real sense in which they don't exist. I think an important sense in which, when we characterize the world, they're still written down there, but they're not formally enforced, and they're also not socially enforced. Right. Ultimately, on our view, if you want to know what an institution really is or a society really is, you're talking about the incentives actually existing among actual people, which means in some sense, the social law, so to speak, is the primary one, and formal law is one incentive creating entity that tries to shift these incentives, but always already working in a world of pre-existing, so to speak, incentives. So in the sense that matters, I would say they don't exist. The company one's tricky. That's one thing I still want to completely wrap my head around. Because one part of me is inclined to say a company is just a collection of people. And in one paper, we talk about, what is it? Limited liability corporation. We show how 3 people on the island can have dividends, limited liability corporation, all that stuff. But we didn't dare try and give persistence conditions for these things. And that is the problem, right? When does the company persist? When is it the same company, not the same company? Not sure if I'm going to come down on the view that ultimately a company is just people. Might go towards the view it's just a set of agreements ultimately, or a set of possible agreements. One little footnote: a company that's dormant but registered, of course, there's some incentives involved there. That's why you can often sell them. You don't have to go through the legal hassle of various kinds, and it looks more reputable to outside people when they say the company has been acting for a while. So there's not no incentives involved there, right? There is something. But the bigger issue is the matter of the nature of formal law. How seriously should we take when the law says something exists? Now, there's a sense in which obviously we should, because, the law is powerful. It will enforce all of that. But I have a paper coming out in Dialectica about the case of Somaliland. So Somaliland is an autonomous region of Somalia. They issue passports in their name. They defend their borders. They have their own currency. They have their own government. They have all the things we normally associate with a country, but they're not recognized by anybody. They're not recognized by the UN. They're recognized by a few, I think, small municipalities in Wales for reasons of their own. But to a first approximation, they don't have any official recognition. And the question we ask, well, is Somaliland a country, right? Even though it's not recognized as such. And this speaks then to the question of when the law says the company exists, we're going to end up with the answer. We don't necessarily take that as definitive, or even when the law says this law exists. So here's the analogy I always use. Famously in the 80s, the American government, one of the state governments, they had a state law where there needed to be a certain amount of vegetables in, school lunches, and they wanted to cut it to 1 less. So the way the story goes is they declare ketchup a vegetable. Now, strictly speaking, that's not what happened. It was a weird kind of horseradish, but it became known as the ketchup is a vegetable controversy, right? Now, that's the sort of thing the law says. And once you start looking, the law says all sorts of crazy things, right? Now, no one who works on the nature of vegetables and science should take this seriously. That would be madness. The law says Microsoft is a person. I wouldn't do philosophy of mind based on that. The laws of cricket says if your arm's bent less than 12 degrees, it's straight. I would not try and do mathematics with that definition of, straight. So the law has its own reasons why it often makes these judgments that are, if interpreted descriptively, which they clearly are not, but if interpreted descriptively, it's just false, right? And that's not an objection to the law, because that's not what the law is doing. It's regulating, it's not describing. But it does mean that what the law says, or the way the law characterizes the world, can often be a very poor guide to description, right? The categories in law are supposed to serve normative purposes and regulative purposes, not descriptive purposes. So the argument we make is we should be real careful with just wholesale importing the legal categories, say, of a country, or for that matter, a company, whether it exists or doesn't exist, because the law says all sorts of crazy things that we are often likely to ignore. And here you can think of the whole history of loopholes. One of my favorite examples, I think, was Second World War. The Dutch government fled. They were in Canada, and then a baby was going to be born, and the baby couldn't eventually be king or queen or something, because you have to be born in the Netherlands. And Canada did something, it's not quite what they did, but equivalent to saying this hospital room for these few hours today count as part of Netherlands, right? Now, clearly, in a very real sense, it's just not. It was just a legal dodge. But that's the sort of thing you find in religion a lot, obviously. You get all sorts of loopholes people exploit it to technically comply with the law. Now, what we explain in our paper is, why does the law do that? Well, we say it's a little bit like, because the law is ultimately a functionalist, computationalist system. The law has to take certain events or states of affairs and translate them into rewards and punishments. And the set of claims that get you from the input to the output, from the set of events to the punishments and rewards, it really does not matter. It's just something, think of it a bit like a computer program. It has to take this input, give the right output, and they're not particularly bothered about what happens in between. Now, in theory, you could write the law as a bunch of if statements. So you have if, then you list all the possible events, then, and you list all the possible legal consequences. But you don't do that for the same reason computer programmers don't do that. Rather, what do? Well, they declare variable names, and then beneath that, they'll have things like if statements and so on. And when the computer program stops working, when there's a bug, a computer programmer, often you can fix the problem by just tweaking a variable name, right? You can just declare this variable and have it have a slightly different definition. And as long as the computer output is fine, then you fix the bug. You can't tell the computer programmer, no, definitions must stay constant. You're messing with the definition. That's a bad idea. Rather, you have to go change it somewhere at the bottom in your if statements or something like that. And the law is the same way. The law is it's a bit like Quine and holism in epistemology, right? It doesn't matter what we change as long as we get the right output. And often for symbolic reasons or reasons of ease, we will change the terminology instead of the statement. But that's not something we can easily or should easily do when it comes to descriptive tasks. I mean, give you a very easy example. In cricket, we could have just said with cricket, well, you can bowl with an arm that's bent less than 12 degrees, but we're sort of emotionally attached to the notion of a straight arm in cricket. It's definitive of the action of bowling, so that would hurt our hearts to do. So instead, we just define a straight arm as one bent less than 12 degrees. Or say a penalty try in rugby. You could have said it's a try, it's a kind of try, it's a penalty try. Alternatively, you could say there was no try, but we're giving you 5 points to penalize the other side. But we decided to change the terminology instead of the statement because, ultimately what we're dealing with is sort of computational. The rules of rugby and cricket and the country are a computational system to go from events to, rewards and so on. So when the law says ketchup is a vegetable, when the law says Somaliland's a country, when the law says this company exists, it's not obvious we have to take it seriously. Put it that way. We argue in our paper that if your purposes are descriptive, and descriptive of a certain kind, there are descriptive purposes for which Somaliland should not count, say recipients of foreign aid, because they're not officially a country, they can't get foreign aid, right? But if your purposes are, say, some comparison of economies in various countries and how monetary policy affects it, then yes, Somaliland counted. Don't count England and Scotland. And in fact, a lot of countries in Europe you probably shouldn't count the European Union. Interestingly enough, the CIA World Fact Book lists, among the countries they list the European Union because for purposes of economics, that's the unit you're dealing with. So take another case. This didn't make me overly popular in Europe, although my hosts were lovely otherwise. But I told them that in any descriptively useful sense of king, or most descriptive sense, not all, they don't have kings anymore. They haven't had kings for a very, very long time. The king of Eswatini, Swaziland is a king. And, the ruler of North Korea is a king, Kim Jong-un. But what Europe and Britain has is sort of, mascots, sort of living reminders of the past, which you might be in favor of or not in favor of, but it's just not a king. Of course, it's a bit like the arm in cricket, right? They would rather tweak in practice the terminology than, make some or other claim about the world. So the point is legal terminology, nothing wrong with it, but it changes in response to regulatory constraints, not descriptive constraints. So it's often a very, very poor guide to description. So I don't have a good answer to you, but that's the direction my answer is going to go when I start looking at companies. I mean, give an interesting example, right? There's a case to be made. So everyone knows about the trouble with Boeing. Boeing has had a lot of trouble lately, as we all know. So it used to be two big competing companies, amongst others. So Boeing and McDonnell Douglas. And Boeing was known as sort of the engineers' company, so to speak, right? It was really engineers. They promoted engineers. They were run by engineers. McDonnell Douglas, much more of a businessman company. So derogatory, you could say the MBA-run company, right? It's all PowerPoints and Excel. And when McDonnell Douglas didn't make it, Boeing absorbed them. But one version of the story, don't know if this is true, but let's assume it is the executives of McDonnell Douglas were much, much better at sort of, corporate, interpersonal sort of politics than the engineers at Boeing. And so gradually over time, they got into a lot of power at Boeing to where, while the claim is online, you'll often find people will flat out say Boeing doesn't exist. It's McDonnell Douglas under a different label. And I don't know if that's ultimately the best way to characterize it, but I'm open to that form of characterization. So the law will say Boeing still exists, But for descriptive purposes, maybe it does make sense to say, well, Boeing doesn't exist. McDonnell Douglas took over Boeing and have conquered it and are now running it under the label Boeing. I think, don't know if I'll come down on that side, but I don't think it's a terrible way to look at things, put it that way. So what the law says about stuff, the best way to interpret the law doesn't say anything about stuff. Paper we're now subsequently writing is to say you should think of all those legal claims as having only syntactic content, because that only matters in as much as it leads to a specific consequence. Doesn't make any claims about the world of that nature one way or another that could be true or false. So when the law says this is a company, all they're really saying is if you act in the following way, then you have limited legal liability and you don't have to register again, and so on and so forth, or whatever the practical consequence of having a dormant company. And, you know, the main one of a company is obviously limited liability. That's also how we understand corporate personhood, right? It's not a claim about anything that people need to get upset by. It's just one very odd way of saying some debts you're just not liable for.
I really like that account. As a practicing lawyer, I often have a client who will say to me, I've read the Constitution and I can do X. And I say to them, well, the ordinary meaning of that word just doesn't apply. There's all of this play that's gone on over years. And so we've got a rarefied private language in the law where a particular term just means something totally different. And so, you know, if you go back to Searle, it's that idea of the context is going to matter quite a lot for determining, you know, what the thing means. There's an interesting case in we call abrogation by disuse. So Jason mentions these things with their own statute books that never get removed. And then what happens is one day someone decides to do something about it. So one of the famous cases in South African law is a guy who he sued his wife's lover. He said, you've seduced my wife, taken her away from me, and there's a common law action of seduction. And so I want to be paid. And so in the 1970s, the courts dealt with this, and they said, we've looked through the case law, and we see that no one has done this in the last 70 years. You're the only guy. And we think it's abrogated by disuse. So they say you don't have an action. And so there's an interesting question about time, which is at what point did this thing cease to be a law? It was a law at some point. You can imagine the 1800s, people suing their spouses' lovers and being successful. And then at some point, the behavior stopped. And at some point in time, a judge discovers that this is no longer the law, because the judge will say, I don't make law, I just tell you what the law is. Mm-hmm. And I've discovered this. So if I think about what you've said, it seems that some institutions can pop out of existence because the incentives disappear. And maybe we discover this at some point in time. And maybe it's a bit of a, Sorites paradox that, there's no particular amount of years that have to go by or particular amount of time people stop believing in the thing. Maybe things can pop in and out of existence. So with the dormant company, as you say, if it's dormant for long enough and no one has bought the shelf company and no one really knows about it anymore, that the incentive to operate with it just isn't there. But then at some point, someone does, and then it sort of pops back into existence. Jason's always been wary about the idea of objects being able to phase in and out. And Jason's ultimate view really is this anarchist view that a whole bunch of these social things just don't exist. But yeah, I wonder if you think that there's a virtue in saying that they do continue to exist, that you don't want to go down the route of Jason.
Well, so I share Jason's fear, right, for when things pop out in and out of existence, because if you start trying to give persistence conditions, probably you're going to have as a necessary condition, continuous history, right? Because otherwise, theory institutions is going to look like Parfit theory of mind. You're going to have, here's the 20 companies, which is the real one, so on and so to speak. So it would be, best if you can block that sort of move. It's an interesting thing about the legal language there, right? So this is what I think institutional ontology, one thing is good for, right? It's not necessarily giving you, sometimes it'll give you insights, but very often it'll just block terrible ideas, right? So if people understand that legal language is not descriptive, that you need to, it's common words that over time drift away from their ordinary meaning, and their only meaning that you need to care about is the basis on which it's been described, and more importantly, the actual consequences of having this term in there, then that would be better. And I really do like the analogy to a computer language. Also, it's interesting law. It's even written like that, right? So good programmers always tell you avoid global variables. You don't know what chaos you're going to cause down the line. Define it local variables for as narrow range as possible. The law will do the same thing. So for this statute specifically, the word means this, but really not committing to the global variable that means that everywhere else, because who knows what else is in there. I mean, ultimately on these issues, it is tricky. My sentiments tend to be sort of nominalist and conventionalist, right? So when I'm seeking the theory of companies here, I think you'll discover some stuff that's interesting. So the essence of it is going to be, limited legal liability. And to a first approximation, the rest, I think I'll definitely come down on the side of, well, there's going to be different ways of characterizing it. So we could say, Boeing still exists, but unfortunately it's changed fundamentally in character because of the people of McDonnell Douglas. I don't think that's a horrible way to express it. Or you can say Boeing popped out of existence. Boeing ultimately got swallowed by McDonnell Douglas. Boeing doesn't exist. McDonnell Douglas under a different label. I think for certain epistemic projects, certain categories will be more useful than others. So sometimes I think it would make sense to use the legal category of a country. Sometimes, say, if you're doing a cross-country economic comparison, probably it's going to make more sense to have a criterion that, excludes, say, England and Scotland, but includes, say, the European Union and so on. So my inclination on this stuff is ultimately going to be to, well, which terminology is going to be least misleading, which terminology is going to give rise to the least confusions and the worst ideas. There's actually a case to be made for trying to really stick to the ordinary use of terms in law, just so people don't get so confused. But realistically, that's probably impossible. I mean, law, normally it's a matter of ease and often a matter of, well, if we pass this law, it looks innocuous. No one really knows that by changing this term here, the downstream effect is something that people would hugely object to, right? So often it's also cynical. And I don't think all cynical behavior is, going to disappear. So I don't know where I've come down yet on the companies. I really, really doubt I'm going to allow them to pop out of existence and come back. But we will see when we get there. Most likely I'll have something like, I don't know, a set of agreements that can still be entered into, even though no one at present has entered into it. And these agreements will change over time, but there will be a continuous history of these agreements.
I want to give one last objection. It's not an objection to the view that you've given here, because your view covers institutions and money. Well, money is an institution, but the objection I want to give is just to argue that this isn't extendable to groups. So when you talk about the empty corporate, the empty corporation, you say that there's still a set of agreements in place, although there's no one agreeing to them anymore. There's a set of agreements in place such that should people re-enter the corporation, those agreements would kick in. Also, should someone purchase the corporation, those agreements would kick in. But social groups are not like that. You often have social groups without any agreements in place and without any incentives. In fact, you might be disincentivized from being part of a social group. So I'll give you an example. I was born into a Jewish family, and for a very long time, I wanted nothing to do with my Judaism. That ironically has changed since October 7th last year. But for a very long time, I wanted nothing to do with my Judaism. There was no incentive for me to be part of the group. And yet I was just forced to be part of this group. So Jews considered me Jewish, regardless of whether I said, I'm just not. They said, no, but you are. You were born Jewish and you're Jewish. You have a Jewish mother. That's the criterion that they collectively agree is the criterion. And I just was Jewish, but there was no incentive. Another example is a chess club. So you've got this chess club. It seems like there's incentives to being part of the chess club, but over time, everyone leaves the chess club. One after another, the members fade away, they die, they leave, they move to other chess clubs until there's no one in the chess club. Okay. But what we might say is that even though there's no one in the chess club, that chess club could be revived at some later stage and new members could join it. So let's call it the Knights War. So the Knights War Chess Club at the first point in time has lots of members. It's very active. At time 2, all those members have disappeared. And at time 3, new members join and say, we are reviving the Knights Chess Club. It always existed. It existed at the point when it had members. It existed at the point where it had no more members, and it exists again now. It's not clear what the collective agreements are involved. It's not clear that there are agreements. It's just this is the group. But it persists through time despite a change in membership. And at the point in time where there's no members, it doesn't seem like there's any incentives or agreements involved, but it persists through time. You might say, hold on, it existed at time 1, it didn't exist at time 2, and it did exist at time 3. So then you've got this group that exists, pops out of existence, and then the very same group pops back into existence at a later stage. That's the alternative explanation, which I just don't understand how it could be the same group. We don't see things in nature popping in and out of existence and being the same thing. And this is a discussion that Mark and I have often had about drug use and whether you could be the same person before and after drug use. But let's put that aside. The question I have is, I think you've given a very interesting account of institutions. Could we apply to groups, given that we don't have the same characteristics in groups?
The thing we want to look to as, say, a social category, for instance, is, that of a friend or that of an enemy, right? Exactly. So people very much, it's, they will describe themselves as this one's friend, this one's enemy, and so on. And obviously, it'll be reciprocated, right? And there's this social category. Then, of course, the usual ones that people are interested in. So, race, gender, and so on and so forth. And what gets interesting in this, precisely like you say about, say, Jewishness or something, these sort of descriptive categories where they seem very, very Searlean. So it seems, you are, I'm Afrikaans. So, you are Afrikaans to some degree if people consider you Afrikaans, for instance, right? That sort of stuff. My inclination is to think that probably it's better if we figure out which exact beliefs and incentives will obtain in virtue of that. So what people will believe about you, how they will treat you. That's something you have to think about anyway, right? You have to think, well, if someone calls me, well, you're a gwa, but they don't mean anything by gwa. They don't attach importance to it. They're not going to believe anything about me in virtue of it. They're not going to treat me differently in terms of it. Then I'm happy to say that description is completely meaningless, right? Being a gwa is not a thing. These categories we care about, so, being Afrikaans, being Jewish, and so on, clearly we care because there's certain beliefs and certain incentives that follow in virtue of them. And my guess is going to be that we're going to say, well, that captures the full and total value of it. And I think that'll probably help with the pop in and out of existence problem, because then it becomes easier to say that we don't need persistence conditions that, clearly seem to have been taken from God himself, but rather that it's sort of a practical characterization that in this context it could work well, this context it could work well. The things you need to care about are the things you end up, the ways you act, the things you believe, things other people believe about you, so on and so forth. And so my guess is we will be some mix of that and a sort of nominalist account, but I'm not completely sure. I'm not sure about that, right? The core of the Searlean thing is this descriptive element, right? It's a president because we think it's a president. You are Jewish because we think you are Jewish, all that sort of stuff. And our guess is we can ultimately reduce that, but I can't honestly say that we're confident outside of institutional facts. Inside institutional facts, we're pretty confident about that. And in fact, we've done the reduction. That's why we get sometimes accused by people of saying institutions don't exist.
Well, JP, I want to thank you for a fabulous discussion. It's a very complicated topic, and you've done a masterful job of explaining it in a way that is understandable. And it's been delightful to watch you and Jason sort of clash swords in a way that I think, leads to more light, that there's sparks flying off your swords, and that's wonderful. Jason and I disagree about whether Brain Nevada is an institution. I certainly think it is. And as members of our institution, we'd love you to leave a comment. Tell us what you thought about today's episode. If you're listening on Spotify, please send us a voice note.